Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by High Performance Director Eric Renaghan. Eric is currently the High Performance Director of the Italian Ice Hockey Federation, which is a governing body for the sport in Italy. He was named the head strength and conditioning coach of the St. Louis Blues from 2016 to 2020. He was a member of the 2019 Stanley Cup championship team. Prior to his position with the Blues, he held the title of assistant strength and conditioning coach for the Vancouver Canucks and San Jose Sharks, respectively. He received his master's degree in biomechanics at Lindenwood University. His main areas of interest were neuromechanics and movement expression. Really in-depth conversation that we have with Eric today. We talk about his background in high-performance hockey. We get a really deep dive into athlete profiling. We also talk about the use of force plates in the sport of ice hockey. It's a fantastic episode. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Eric. Thanks so much for joining us, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You're one of the first guys I wanted to get on. Obviously, a ton of respect for you intellectually, your background in hockey. I want to start by asking, 2019 Stanley Cup champs, babe. Come on, man. That's got to be one of the coolest experiences, accomplishments. How does it feel having your name on the Stanley Cup?
Yeah, no, I mean that was the roller coaster year. I'd summarize it that way. You know, I think if we think back to that year, I don't know if it was December or January, we were in last place in the entire NHL. And
wow,
I think as most of the listeners know, if you're not in a playoff position by American Thanksgiving in the NHL, generally, you're probably going to have a real long off season. And yeah, it was certainly a roller coaster going from that feeling of, what are we going to be doing in April here and to playing all the way through mid-June. So it was certainly a roller coaster. I would summarize it that way.
Roller coaster in terms and measures of looking back at it now through the rear view, right? You've got a ring, you've got your name on the Stanley Cup, which is pretty awesome. How would you describe, if you could give us, what were the tangible intangibles that year? Like, there's got to be something special. I get it. Luck plays a role at times. Timing plays a role. You've got to have the horses. But what were some of the tangible intangibles that you saw throughout the stretch that really kind of separated you guys from the pack?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing for us, kind of looking back on that, was purpose. There was purpose to everything that we did, whether it was the systems that were put in place for the athletes to be successful. Obviously that comes down from management and coaching staff. We had a really strong management team with Doug Armstrong at the head of that. We had, when I first got there, Marty Brodeur, who I think impacted the culture there significantly. Al McInnes, obviously, Ryan Miller in hockey operations. And I think with the coaching staff all being former NHLers and guys that, were not too far removed from playing in the NHL, was a really, a good opportunity for me from a performance standpoint to say, these are the things that I think we need to be doing in order to stay ready and perform at a high level and really find ways to complement that system. So I think the best word I can put on that, as far as intangibles was, we were always staying prepared and we were ready for, to not necessarily be reactionary to, our circumstances, but to try to control our circumstances as best as we could with the strengths around our roster.
Well, yeah, and making it to the Stanley Cup final and winning a Stanley Cup is almost a mini season in and of itself with all the best of 7 series. You talked about systems a lot in staying ready. Is there anything you could share with the listeners, kind of lifting up the hood and showing us, like, what was it that you thought were your anchor points at that time in terms of measurement for fatigue? How did you make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a decision-making standpoint, for me, it was about being as objective as I could.
Okay.
I think knowing the system that Chief wanted to play, which was we were a heavy team. We were actually, quite heavy from a veteran standpoint as well. And I think that way of or that style of play and the ability to support that was easy, right? We were going to bang the other team. We were going to dump the puck in, force them to retrieve that puck. And if they did, they were going to pay for it physically. And, that for me as a performance coach, that's like a dream come true, right? Because we just need to be bigger, faster, stronger than the other guys and be able to sustain that. And, it was a real simple task for me. I think, from saying that though, you have to think about the strategies that you take to get there and how you do those things. Over 82 games plus, we played 26 out of 28 playoff games that year. And, going back and thinking, okay, yeah, it sounds simple, but it was really important to be objective and find what we could be doing, as from a team perspective, but more from an individualized perspective. So I really think that, having the support of the coaching staff, the management group, and then, I was in my third, fourth year there at that point. So I had a pretty good relationship with the players and some good buy-in from the players. So that whole year turned out to be kind of, like I said, it was a roller coaster, but once we got through that sticky point here, the middle of the year, we were able to really say, this is why we've been doing the things we've been doing. So let's keep trying to stay on track here and hopefully, luck's on our side and we get a couple bounces, which we did, and we ended up winning.
I spoke to a couple of the strength coaches in the National Hockey League talking about this idea. Dan Pfaff would say it is managing versus developing, right? Development typically comes in the offseason, not all the time, but development, essentially really focusing on stress management. Would you agree with that in terms of management development from an 82-game hockey season? Are we as strength coaches or physical practitioners, are we more worried about management at that time as opposed to, developing certain physical qualities, or can they be done simultaneously?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a lot of discussion that goes on around how people are going to prioritize certain capabilities or certain ways of supporting their athletes. I think, without the ability to objectively look at a few different things and see how those things affect the athletes, it's impossible to say with a lot of certainty that we can get better in season. But if you think about it from the other side of the spectrum, we're with these guys for 9 months or longer, throughout the year. And if we don't take that opportunity at some point to try to improve on something, then we're missing a big opportunity, right? And so I looked at it from the perspective of the, ability to say, what is our lowest hanging fruit in, 4 or 5 different key sectors of human performance. And in any of those, 4 or 5 sectors, is there an opportunity to get better at something? And my perspective is certainly. And if we look at it from the lens of working on weaknesses, there's always something that athlete can get better at, whether that's getting better at sleep and not just saying you got to sleep more, but giving strategies and tools to sleep better, whether that is, improving your metabolic capacity to recover between shifts or to perform at a high enough level during your shift. There's always something that you can probably be doing to improve. So I think if you look at it from that perspective, you're maintaining certain qualities, absolutely. But my thought process was, let's get better if we can, and let's take the time that we have together to get better.
Well stated. You worked in the National Hockey League, 3 different clubs: Blues, Canucks, and Sharks. What were some of the lessons that you took with you? They don't have to be, physically performance-based. Maybe it was communication, whatever it may be. But what are a couple of the big aha moments that you had during your time in the National Hockey League?
I think the experience coming from those 3 different teams, all being in the Western Conference, it allowed me to kind of see what the different styles of hockey were, what was really important to be successful in the West versus how the East played. I think having the ability to work for a team that's, at one corner of the continent and then working for a team in the middle of the country has certainly was an opportunity to really dial in my processes around managing travel fatigue, managing sleep, and really trying to find ways to stay fresh. But I think overall, from an organizational standpoint, it was really about how to effectively communicate with different people that have different experiences, that are in roles that dictate what you're able to do as a practitioner, but also what the team overall is going to be doing from a philosophy standpoint. And really having, I think I had 7 to 8 coaches in my time in the NHL.
Wow.
Obviously I had, two outstanding practitioners as mentors, Mike Potenza and Roger Takahashi, being their assistants. And I think just taking those different ways of communicating, and then I would say the last piece was really having the opportunity to work with some legends in the game. I guess best way to describe these guys. I was able to work with Joe Thornton, Patrick Marleau, Joe Pavelski, obviously the Sedins, Kevin Bieksa, who's probably one of the best dudes I ever met in my time in the NHL. And then, getting to work with guys like O'Reilly, Jay Bouwmeester, Petro, those, and in St. Louis. So I think different styles of communication, different ways of communicating, and just understanding how the philosophy of the organization and the management, how to support that philosophy and the way that management wants to go.
I guess success leaves clues. That's a question I often ask, and communication always comes back to it. I would imagine that it's imperative to have the gatekeepers in the room, if it's possible, right? It's meaning coaching staff, management, ATs, PTs. In a perfect world, which we don't live in, that would probably be the best way to communicate, so we know that we're all on the same page. Is that what you found from a successful standpoint of communication? Everybody was on the same page. The most successful teams were that way, or did you see siloed, unfortunately, for lack of a better word?
I don't think that it was always the case that everyone was on the same page. I think it was more of a sense of, this is the rationale why, how I'm going to go about getting these things done, and being able to communicate that effectively. I don't necessarily think that it was, we're all in agreement at all times on the best way of doing things, but it was more about being transparent and communicating that. And there was a ton of arguments. It's like sitting at dinner at Thanksgiving. There's always going to be that healthy argument, right? And so, thinking back about that, it was definitely more similar to that, where we came to a consensus at the end of the day. That this is the rationale why I think we should be going about this in this manner, and everybody come to that consensus saying, okay, let's do that and make sure it's working. If it's not, then we need to figure it out, right? So going back, I think it's more, it was never really siloed. It was never really everyone on the same page. It was more about that healthy discussion and just really, is your argument the best?
Yeah. Well, I love that, and I think that's the formulation of all new knowledge. What's the best explanation, and no ego aside, right? Hey, you know what? That makes sense to me. There's debate, there's healthy debate, intellectual debate. I want to pivot. Obviously, you're one of the first people that I think of when I think objective, using in the applied. I use that word applied technology and application point, not just the technology, but I'm talking about interventions. Whether it's force plates, profiling, and I want to pivot our conversation to that area. I know you're very passionate about it. I know you just recently gave a lecture on profiling. Yep. So I want to ask, what is athlete profiling? There's going to be strength coaches that listen to this. There's going to be head coaches that listen to this. There's going to be PTs, ATs. But what's profiling, and why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, we got to figure out kind of what the priority is, right? The goal of every performance staff is going to be able to provide their athletes with the opportunity to outperform their peers. And that generally is the overall overreaching team philosophy in most cases. And I think from a performance standpoint, it's really about staying as healthy as possible when doing that. And I think the difficulty for most people and most organizations in doing that is executing on all the decision-making processes that come along with sustaining healthy high performers. And, from a profiling standpoint, if we break it up and say profiling is the assessment of an athlete, that's going to allow us to reveal what we as coaches or performance staff are going to be able to exploit, and, also reveal what we shouldn't tamper with. And I think that's really where we can make some, better decisions on future training. And, thinking about profiling, in a more individualized way of thinking about profiling is looking at matching the right workout with the right athlete based on their entire system. And, from that standpoint, a well-designed performance profile is going to enhance that athlete's self-awareness, and it's going to allow them to have a better sense of ownership over the characteristics that are going to facilitate a successful performance for them individually.
Well, so a rifle-like approach as opposed to a shotgun approach. We talked about this in the profiling. You talked about assessment of the athlete. Could you dive deeper? Do you have buckets that you assess? Is it movement? Is it stress response? What's important that you feel and you could tie it to the hockey playing population. I don't know if it's bucketed by sport, but what do you feel are those assessment exercises or means that you use?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to break it in. If you want to think about it from a bucketing perspective, or breaking it into kind of different key values, I think the way that I've gone about that is breaking it into 6 distinct kind of like sectors is the best kind of term that I've been able to come up with recently. But the physical abilities of the athlete, and I think I break that up into kind of 2, a physical ability A and physical ability B. One of those being speed.
Okay.
And thinking about all of the different characteristics that are involved in, like say from a skating perspective, what's involved in change of direction, acceleration, speed, and then looking at the mechanical characteristics of that athlete and their capabilities to say produce force, to create strength, etc. The second sector would be an orthopedic evaluation. Certainly an orthopedic evaluation can be broken down into, multiple subsets, say like, for example, loading readiness, tissue diagnostics, chronic injury factors for sure.
Sure.
What type of injuries, does this athlete have in their history? And then I think going into the next one that for me is of probably the most importance is resilience, and starting to be able to figure out ways to objectively think about resilience for the athlete. And I think I use resilience as a term to kind of talk about the mental performance. And there's always going to be something that comes up in the season, whether that athlete's just had a baby, maybe they're not playing well, they're out of the lineup, maybe they're injured. There's at any point in the season, any one of your athletes is going to require that type of work to be addressed. So having a way to profile their resilience. Metabolic conditioning for sure is one of those things that makes hockey unique. It has all the characteristics. I was actually talking to somebody about this the other day, and they asked me what's unique about hockey compared to other sports. And to me, it takes every quality from every sport and wraps it up into one. That metabolic aspect of, being able to, recover between your shifts, stay on the ice without feeling like you're going to puke, and perform at a high enough level, but also being ready to get crunched in the end boards.
Sure.
I think those are all different characteristics that are certainly there. And then, for me, that last sector, which I'm pretty passionate about, is biomarker analysis and, understanding kind of what's going on inside the body. We can do all these different things to measure, the speed of an athlete, their strength, force ability, what is their, mobility, their range of motion, etc. But a lot of times we overlook what's actually happening inside the body from a health perspective, and, more importantly with concussion baseline testing, and really, avoiding that gray area when it comes to return to sport from a concussion, or at least the symptoms of the concussion. Having an ability to look at some of these biomarkers, both from blood biomarkers, but also eye biomarkers, I think are critical. And that would kind of sum up I would say the 6 kind of sectors that I generally address when it comes to profiling and, finding something, like I said earlier, if there's always going to be something we can get better at. If that comes back to just supplementing better nutrition, that's a way to improve. And I think those are all the sectors that I've been, really trying to get better at over the last several years at understanding how they can affect our athletes.
This episode has been brought to you by the High Performance Hockey Masterclass. The High Performance Hockey Masterclass is a comprehensive lecture series exploring the science and practice of high performers in the sport of ice hockey. It was designed and created and engineered by myself, Anthony Donskoff. It is an 8-part lecture series that includes metric fixation, the tyranny of metrics, reading research, what matters, going back to get my PhD as a 40-year-old, how do you target your readings in terms of digesting, accumulating, and reading your research, biomechanical considerations for ice hockey, the adductor magnus, how we program hip health during the off-season and in-season, the Gain, Go, Grow model, this idea of a 3-day rollover program for high-performance hockey players, considerations for the in-season, how to manipulate that model for high performers, our communication structure within the confines of Donskoff Strength and Conditioning, and finally, the fast and frugal tree, considerations for return to play. More information on the High Performance Hockey Masterclass can be found at anthonydonskov.gumroad, road.com. Thanks for listening. That's outstanding and very detailed, so I appreciate that. I want to piggyback two questions, and I'll do one at a time.
Sure.
So you talked about objectifying. My question for you is, looking at those pillars that you've just mentioned, how do you choose the right technology to measure them? And I get it. There's going to be budget, reliability, validity, but what have you found that you feel has done the best job of getting the best objective information into your hands as a coach?
Yeah, I mean, I think from you certainly touched on validity of the math and validity of how this assessment is being completed. I think those are certainly going to be probably the most important things. And I think that even comes back to how I would assess different technologies or different products, right?
Okay.
But most importantly, I think from an applied standpoint, the efficiency of the piece of technology or the piece of apparatus that you're going to be using to make that assessment has to be one that, from my perspective, needs to be integrated into the training environment. I think with the density of travel and game schedules at the NHL level, at least, having a laboratory and a testing day is not practical, right?
Yeah.
So the efficiency of use certainly was probably the most important thing outside of it. Is the math right? The next thing I would look at is, how can I export this data, right? Because visualization and putting data into context and actually taking data and turning it into actionable insights has to happen for it to be useful. And that's where being able to export that data, either does the dashboard that this tech provide allow you to look at the data in a manner that provides insight, or can I actually take that data out of your system effectively and plug it into, maybe if I have an AMS or some other sort of system. And I think those are probably my two biggest features that I'm looking for when it comes to tech and profiling.
I think that's brilliant. I think time efficiency, right? Training is testing, testing is training. So you're able to collect that data and then being able to synthesize it and make sense of it. If you're spending all day on Excel or all day doing whatever, number one, it's hard to get that information quickly to someone's hands, and you're taking time away doing other things that perhaps you should also be doing, whether it's the nutrition part, the training part, et cetera. The other question I was going to piggyback on is obviously you've got, biomarkers, metabolic, resilience. Do you have a team of professionals that do this? Have you met people that are a part of that team from a profiling standpoint, or do you take that all within yourself and find other resources?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, from my experience, I had, like you talked about earlier, a couple different teams that I've worked for, and in those different teams, you either have, more resources as far as personnel that you're working with that can take the lead on some of these areas of assessment or opportunity, or you have less. And I think it really comes down to your comfort level as a practitioner on some of the things that you can, take under your guys and oversee, or being able to find professionals that might be experts in those areas and really outsourcing this information to them as far as, support on things that you should be looking for, ways to, simplify some of the things that you might be able to assess, and then integrate an intervention. But I've had both opportunities. I've had the opportunity to, to have to do it all myself, or be, not have to, but the chance to do it all myself and really get as I don't know if the word is that, get as good at looking at things as I could have, but really having a better understanding at different aspects that contribute to performance.
Sure.
But I've also had the opportunity to really learn from some high-level practitioners that were experts in those areas. So I think it depends on your situation, but there's a lot of tools out there now, a lot of technologies out there now that make it pretty convenient to start to figure out how to, create or draft a profile for your athletes.
Piggybacking a question, you mentioned AMS, athlete management systems. Could you give the listener, what did you find successful when you were a part of the National Hockey League? And then in the private setting, maybe someone on a constricted budget, could you give us, two ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think before you open any software, you need to really communicate with your team and plan on what you're going to be tracking in the time that you have available to decide what data you need. So that would be my first, I guess, step in deciding that, is an AMS something that we need? Is it going to be useful for us? And do we have the budget to pay for that AMS? So I think from that perspective, it was, for me, it was most important to work out the flow of kind of my operations. And, I think anybody will tell you that moving between variables can take time, but you need to really ensure that there's going to be a logical flow with your data. What's going to happen most often with your athletes, and, can we measure that? And then are there going to be things that are interrelated from different ways of assessing your athletes? So when it comes to an AMS, generally I would say the better experiences that I had using different AMS systems and tools for aggregating data were the ones that allowed me to actually visualize my data more effectively. And then, I would say probably even more impactful was to automate some returns on what that data was, because it really comes down to making intervention, right? When you talked about it earlier, we can look at all these different things and we can have all this data, and there's going to be listeners, I think, that are going to have someone probably in their organization is just dedicated to collecting data. But that mountain of data doesn't do us any good if we don't turn it into actionable insight. And that's to me where my experience using AMS systems of various types really came back to. I can put all this data together, but if I don't have a way to automate my returns, meaning I can't make my interventions quick and efficient, then it wasn't very useful for me.
Interventions. So I want to go right into that. Again, we talked about this idea of the pillars that you had mentioned in profiling. Could you give the listener an idea of some interventions that you might make based on the data? Maybe it's a fictional player with a knee injury, or maybe it's someone that had some sort of a speed or a mechanical disadvantage or inadequacy in their testing. How would those interventions be applied?
Yeah, I mean, so let's suppose we've had this athlete that we've done some sprint profiling with, and I like to use your example a lot of how you've broken down kind of the characteristics of a hockey stride, and I think that is quite useful for understanding where the drivers or the underpinnings are for what we can actually measure, as far as like if we're measuring blue line to blue line speed, what are those underpinnings that are driving that measurement, and then the strategies that these athletes are taking to actually skate and make contact with the ice. So I think if we break it up and we say, okay, what are the interventions? I think we have to start with thinking about how we collect that data and the possible different outcomes that we need to determine as far as data points, and how those data points are going to influence our decisions, and what data points, more importantly, should we ignore? Are there going to be things that we collect that we just don't need, right?
So true.
And you're thinking about like intervention and creating an opportunity for this athlete to get better. There's likely going to be few metrics that have the most impact on our decisions. And I've been recently looking at conditional logic as a way to identify if this is happening, then show this return, right? Show this intervention. And if you apply conditional logic as a kind of a way of interpreting or sorting your actions, you can customize that on interventions and more importantly, your accessible options, right? In the NHL, you go to every rink and you're going to have the Reg rack, right? Reg Grant, I think you had him on. And, when he was when he was in charge of some of the NHL Strength and Conditioning Association's kind of process of let's get better, let's support our staffs a little bit better. They put in this rack in every rink. So, you're going to have a 45-pound bar, you're going to have a couple of bumper plates, you're going to have, power blocks. And, depending on what team was there before you, there still might be bands left and still might be lacrosse balls. There might not be, but, those accessible options also come into play when it comes to being on the road for 2 weeks at a time and still having to work with your athletes. So, being able to identify those rate limiters and, those are going to be the ways that you go about creating these interventions. And, generally you can say like, is this athlete strong but not elastic? Is this athlete anemic, or is this guy just lazy? Is there a skill issue with this athlete or some underlying anatomical restriction? And then that's where you can start to say, here's our measurements that's going to allow me to create those interventions. And I think conditional logic, decision trees, those types of, if this, then that type of strategies allow for us to make those interventions quicker. So, your question about speed and talking about looking at, an athlete that we might say is slow or fast.
Sure.
We have to, I think, building a decision tree around sprint profile is going to help us determine whether we're going to focus on sprint training or acceleration, or this might, going back to your style of describing the hockey strategy, it might be a technique issue that we need to work on.
Yep.
So how we're going to get that data that we need to be evaluated so that we can make those interventions. And I think it comes down to, having some objective tools, right? Let's suppose we've built the decision tree around that sprint profile for that skater. That's going to help us determine whether to focus on sprint training or acceleration, or like we talked about, technique. We're most likely, most of us are going to use some sort of timing gate system. If you have the opportunity to use a laser, that's generally really nice, but you're going to capture those sprint intervals at various distances. Then we're going to use those intervals to calculate a force velocity profile for our athletes. And that's going to give us the relevant data points to run through and put into our conditional logic feature. And that's where being able to identify those characteristics, is this athlete, I think Charlie Weingroff used this years ago, the lazy athlete, the injured athlete, the unskilled athlete, and the weak athlete all look the same, right?
Yeah.
But those 4 different categories require different interventions to improve. And I think that's where having the ability to take that information and say, what's underlying, what's causing what we're able to see. And that's where the interventions come in. And
sure,
with that skating example, the athlete might not have a mechanical flaw in their stride. They might not be weak, and they might not, be injured, but they might be lazy. And that intervention is, very, very different from any of the other 3 that you might take to make that athlete, present better in terms of kind of what we're seeing as far as output. So
sure.
I think it's really important to kind of break it down that way and get a better understanding of actually what we're seeing with that athlete. And then that intervention should tie into that.
Wow. Force plates. You're the first person I called when I invested in our Hawkins dynamic system. The conversation was just unbelievable. I pretty much listened. Well, not pretty much. I listened the whole time and was like, well, I'm a pretty ignorant guy here. You were diving deep under the hood of force plate testing. And I'd love you to be able to share some of your gray matter with our listeners, rather, in terms of measures of your experience working with plates. I really love this, and I don't know if it's changed or not, but I'd like you to expand upon it nonetheless. What really made sense to me is when you broke that jump down into categories. You had strategy, output, and health. Could you kind of expand on those qualities in terms and measures of force plates?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I appreciate you saying that. And secondly, I would say, health and performance is always going to be what we're chasing. I don't think that there's going to be many people that have an argument against, let's get better performing athletes and make them healthy.
Yep.
So from that standpoint, I think there's a contributing factor to both categories, health and performance.
Yep.
And recently, kind of what Jason Lake is a friend of mine who's brilliant, and he's a biomechanist out of the UK, and he uses the term strategy, drivers, and output. And I started to think about that and how that I can utilize that in terms of training athletes. So, take that from him and say, this is what we're actually going to do to create these framework for our athletes and be as efficient as we can. So strategy, I think, is going to be kind of what we see with an athlete in terms of, the things that we can visually see. And then, more importantly, we can measure those nuances in what we can see. So for example, when talking about force plates, it could be counter movement depth, right? We see those guys, in season, you see this a lot is, an athlete gets banged up the night before, and you might be doing some stuff with them in the gym the next day. And, for whatever reason, their back's flared up and they just decide not to really go down very far in their counter movement, right? So that counter movement depth can be considered a strategy, right? I've changed my strategy and how I'm going to create this output that my strength coach wants to measure.
Sure.
From a perspective of time spent in a certain phase of interest, right? Or the percentage of time spent in that phase of interest, that could be a strategy. Am I spending more time decelerating myself than I usually do? Am I spending more time, loading up and using momentum more so than what is average for me? Those are all, examples of strategy. Drivers to me are the kind of those underpinning characteristics that you can actually probably make some sort of training intervention to support or improve, right? So, an example I would say is if we're thinking about, being, able to produce more force, what type of movements can we do or loading schemes can we prescribe to make this athlete be more forceful? And again, that could be, an athlete that needs to use the brakes better. Can you actually produce more braking forces and do that at a high velocity and do that with a lot of quality? Or does this athlete need to be able to accelerate better? Are they losing races to open pucks? Are they, if my D-man is not, getting these loose puck retrievals and he's getting beat the pucks, is there something that I could do to create a better opportunity for this athlete to accelerate?
Yep.
Those are going to be the things that I think about when we're talking about drivers. And then output metrics are simply, the things that we measure, right? That, jump height, jump momentum, which I think is a great one in hockey because it allows us to understand, it's almost kind of one of those collision data points, right? If you weigh this much and you jump, this high, you're moving your mass more effectively than someone maybe that's a lighter weight than you. And I think that understanding of propulsive mass is, going back to communication and going back to kind of these discussions, over the last several years in hockey has been one of those ones that has been the most challenging, right? When you get the GM coming down and the guy may have not played well the night before and the GM tells you this guy's fat, but he's our fastest skater and he's healthy. And then, really trying to say, figure out the words so that you can, say, I know he doesn't look like a model, but, from a health standpoint and a performance standpoint, this athlete is probably in an okay position, right? So those different ways of measuring outputs can contribute to making those conversations a little bit easier. Another good output metric I would say is modified RSI, which gets you, one of those yes or no indicators. Did we get more explosive or not? Right? It's there's not a lot of gray area there. Either jump higher and you jump faster, or you didn't, and that can contribute to a good understanding of what your program's adaptations look like, or what you thought was going to happen with your athletes. Did it really happen?
I don't want you to give away too much of your intellectual, knowledge. And what are, if you could, like, one or two metrics that you would say, for example, I've copied your health, the impulse index, braking and propulsive. I think we tracked all of our AAA kids there with asymmetry indexes this summer, or this season, just to make sure that we were safe and healthy from anyone coming back from RTPs. We had baseline numbers. But could you provide maybe one or two metrics that you might say for strategy and output and health that you'd say for hockey players are really important?
For sure. So I think for health, we think about a couple things. I think from a metric standpoint, that left and right asymmetry could be very, very useful. I think that what we need to do is be very careful with that and say, what does healthy bandwidth look like for that athlete? And so, not to try to say that if we get to 0, we're going to be completely healthy, but understanding what does health look like for that athlete. It might be 8% and they're performing their best, and we just need to make sure that they stay within that bandwidth. So that's number one. Number two, from using that left and right impulse asymmetry index, is to understand that a lot of times on ice, those off ice asymmetries disappear due to skill, right? This athlete might be one of the best skaters in the NHL, or they might be one of the best players in the NHL, and they have an off ice asymmetry of say 10%. But if you were to measure asymmetry on ice, that asymmetry may disappear and drop down to 1 or 2%. So we really have to be cognizant of why we're addressing that number and what is individually healthy, or from a bandwidth standpoint, where is the range that we need to kind of be comfortable with.
Sure.
So from a health standpoint, that's would be my first suggestion. Number two, using different metrics and looking at the relationship of those metrics is important. And I use that term asymmetry as well, right? Where, it's not necessarily left and right, but it might be, what is this asymmetry of their braking net impulse to propulsive net impulse, and where is those relationships to their ability to create force? And is that relationship, does it have a lot of space between their highs and lows in those areas? If it does, there might be some underlying pathology causing them to create forces or dissipate forces a certain way, which needs to be addressed longitudinally, but also, daily when it comes to, hey, we need to kind of think about opportunities that, maybe improve this quality here because it is not as good as this. And that's probably why we're seeing some of these strains that you're having and things of those type of examples. So
Sure.
for health, I would use those two examples.
Okay.
From an output standpoint, I think jump momentum is actually a very good metric. And I think mod RSI as well. I think you can glean more information from those if you wanted to, and they can provide conversation points for you with, whether that's the athlete, your coaches, your GM, your medical staff, and then drivers. I think I really like relative impulse, and I like relative impulse for hockey players because it's essentially velocity. So it provides us with an indicator of the athlete's capacity in the phase of interest. So are they moving faster because they're applying less or same force over more time, or more force over less or the same amount of time? So that relative impulse in the phase of interest is, I think, a really good indicator for their driver.
Okay.
Another good indicator for driver, for me, is going to be the average relative propulsive force. So how much force can this athlete create, right? It ends up turning into kind of what we call relative strength, or, when we describe it from an on-ice perspective, that ability to accelerate, right? How much force can you actually just put into the surface of the ice? So I like those two for drivers because we can train those.
Yep.
Then strategy, that's been an evolving, conversation that I've had over several years with some really smart people. I think I would say there's probably 4 metrics that I would look at in season at different points in the season or different times to identify, where strategy's changing and why we're seeing what we're seeing. One of those is impulse ratio. I like impulse ratio because it allows us to not only see if there's a shift in strategy, like does this athlete, are they becoming more reactive, or are they still relying on momentum? We can also use that as a driver to impact our training, right? Do we want to work on things that are going to be more ballistic, or do we want to be a little bit more stable and work on strength? So I think impulse ratio kind of gives us some insights into both. Counter movement depth, I think, is a really useful metric when it comes to strategy, because as I said earlier, when you see that counter movement depth change and it kind of either goes way above or way below their normal or their average, you're going to probably have something causing that shift. So I like that one. And then, the percentage of time spent in a certain phase, right? So breaking phase percentage or breaking phase duration, I think, is going to give us some insights into maybe some neurological fatigue. And, there might be some, we usually spend this much, 18% of our time in the breaking phase. Now, all of a sudden we're spending, 25 or 20, 6% in that breaking phase. Well, there might be something underlying there. It may not be an injury, it may be fatigue causing you to spend more time in that breaking phase. So I really like those as far as insight goes when it comes to strategy.
Okay.
And I think those are some pretty useful metrics for sure.
I remember when we were speaking about this, and you were talking to me about that, just like you talk about the importance of longitudinal data. I can tell you from when getting our force plates, I didn't have anything to compare them to. Like, you have to, what was good at that time? I had no clue, and to be able to collect a large enough data field to know what you're buttressing up or comparing against. I mean, did that take you a while to make those decisions? You had to collect enough to be able to see trends, correct?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have to just start collecting things, and you have to be able to think about what you're going to try to answer with that data that you're collecting. That for sure is critical. I mean, that there's not going to be any system that is, generally turnkey where you open it up and it's going to tell you, hey, this guy's going to have this problem if you don't do this. That I think, they're the people that say their systems do that are generally, I would say, in my experience, inaccurate because there's so many factors around what might be causing that, right? So, longitudinal data for sure requires lots and lots of data to be collected.
Okay.
When it comes down to, for me, it comes down to collecting data, documenting everything that you're doing from a intervention perspective, and then saying, if I'm looking at trying to improve this with programming and I go back to my data and see that it improved, I can check that box and say, I think this works for this. If I program something and say, I think this is going to help with this quality, and I go back and I don't see that quality improve, then I can say, this is probably not the intervention I'm going to use for that. And once you have enough data and you've been able to track it longitudinally with your interventions that you've documented, you're going to have a better opportunity to say, these are going to be things that I think really work well for X, Y, or Z. These are the things that don't. So here's our programming. And then we're still going to track whether that is effective on our athletes from an adaptation standpoint and from an objective standpoint of what we can measure.
Another piece of advice you gave me, which I don't know if you remember or not, it was brilliant. You said, Anth, there's a lot of metrics here. Really be comfortable with 3 to 5. For us getting used to the plates, we built it into our training as testing as training. We had 1 to 2 metrics in each of those categories. So I really felt comfortable with those metrics before starting to teeter off into other. Was that a strategy that you used as well when you first started? And is that something that you'd recommend to the masses if they're just investing in force plates, they haven't used them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I first was exposed to force plates, there was probably 7 or 8 distinct kind of, here's what, if we see this is what we're doing type of metrics, and I think that probably was a little bit much for me at that point in time.
Yeah.
But I got thrown right into it, and because I had to figure it out, right? But I think for anyone that's starting out with any sort of system, whether it's a force plates, let's say you go out and you buy a Dynaspeed and you want to start to measure and create these kind of load velocity profiles for your athletes or whatever it might be. I think breaking it up into that strategy, driver, and output sector, I guess, or I don't know, whatever we want to call them, but strategy, drivers, and output, I think you can apply across the board. It can go and apply to anything. It could be biomarker analysis. If the output was your vitamin D level is here, what's causing that vitamin D level to be low? And what's going to be the strategy for us to improve that biomarker so that we can see that your immune system is now functioning properly, so you're not getting sick all the time or whatever it might be. It's the same thing with force plates. If you break it up into those 3 distinct categories, I feel like you can take 2 metrics to 3 metrics in each of those categories and really start to learn what the physics are telling you in terms of those 3 distinct categories. And then as you get more comfortable, not only understanding how the physics are being impacted by your programming, by time on ice, by travel schedule, you can then start to think about how other characteristics from a force standpoint can contribute to better understanding or even a more efficient program. And I think that would be my suggestion to anybody starting out with force plates for sure, but in any technology or any sort of profiling strategy, I would say break it up into those 3 categories and take 2 to 3 metrics in each, and you're going to be right around that 6 to 7 metric mark.
Yeah, it's brilliant, and it really helped as I continue to grow with plates. I don't certainly claim to be a content expert, but I'm feeling much more comfortable creating spreadsheets, looking at applied interventions that we can use with our athletes, and that advice was very, very key for me using the plates. Are there any metrics right now that you feel are underappreciated? I know we talked about force at minimal displacement. And I guess when you choose metrics, is it something where you just say, I'm trying to choose a metric based on biomechanics, or is it, hey, regardless of the expression of how it's being vertical or on the ice, I just want to look at the output? How does that work for your decision making?
Yeah, good question. I guess the first question, underappreciated metrics. Well, I think stiffness is probably the most underappreciated metric out there. And I say that because stiffness, let's say, because you have Hawk Dynamics plates, and you have that metric as part of the math and what's being produced for you. It's the force at the lowest point in your movement divided by the depth in meters at the lowest point. So your counter movement depth. So that means more force is generated with less movement, resulting in higher stiffness. Now, if we think about that from a physics standpoint, and you can visualize a force tracing, we look at the unweighting phase or the yielding phase. We get that's highlighted in yellow. We get that shift over into the red, which is the braking phase, right? Which is where we're starting to create those eccentric, braking qualities. And then that shift goes right from braking to propulsive. Now, often overlooked is the switch phase. So what's happening when you start to decelerate and then need to go right into acceleration? It's that switch from braking to propulsion, right? And then we think about Cal Dietz's work with triphasic training. You have, the concentric, the isometric, and the eccentric actions that are being trained. And when we're looking at a force analysis or a tracing from some sort of force analysis that we've done, and we say counter movement jump as an example, we have yielding, unweighting, braking, and propulsion, but we're not talking about that switch phase, right? And we think about switch, we can look at it from multiple lenses. One, if that's stride, we're looking at getting into, start to think about the glide phase, the push off, and the extension turnover, right? Some of the things that you talked about. But that switch comes from the support phase and into the swing phase of the stride. We think about, just the technique. That could be a way of describing that. Another way that we can think about that is when we're changing directions, right? We need to decelerate into that cut, but then we need to be able to accelerate out of that cut. And if we're not doing both of those qualities at a high capacity or high proficiency, we're probably not going to be successful. But what's happening at that point of putting the brakes on to then putting the gas pedal down often gets overlooked. So that stiffness characteristic, I think, can really provide a lot of insights in that switch quality. So I think that's an underappreciated value for sure right now. And I think it's an opportunity for a lot of people to start to dig deeper once they have a good understanding of some of those other concepts, to touch on what we just talked about, which is get a good understanding of some of these, general physics characteristics, and then see how some more nuanced indicators can contribute to, your understanding and improving some of your programming.
Fantastic answer. I want to talk about pivot just a hair. I want to talk on pendulum swings. I asked several colleagues about where are we right now with high performance. I know that's a general question. I'll get a little bit more specific. Where's the pendulum swinging right now, and where do you see it coming to in the next 5 years? And maybe what are we doing wrong, and what do you think we can do better at? And where do you see the profession in the next 5 years? And we'll speak specifically high performance in the National Hockey League.
Yep. Well, so generally speaking in the industry, I think high performance really went in the direction of, technology being like critical. Now, I think where we've shifted over the last year or so has been and really, shifting away from just having technology and having access to data. And really now it's shifting to, can we actually use this data with our group? And can we apply this data so that we actually have something actionable? That's where the pendulum is shifting now. It's kind of swinging back to, I might not have all the tech that I need, but I have enough to understand what I'm going to be doing with each of my guys. I think that's where the pendulum is really kind of coming back to, that point in just being more actionable, and having a good understanding of what that data is telling us. As far as the NHL goes, I think the pendulum's still shifted in that like acquiring technology phase where teams are getting more technology. They're getting GPS units. They're getting more heart rate information. Teams are starting to use Moxie Monitor. They're starting to do things like VO2 Master and look at actual on ice VO2 capacity, force analysis, all these different ways of collecting data. Even look at the combine, right? We took the combine from being in a ballroom at a hotel running pro agility on carpet with a hand timer to, having a specific runway for them using Brower timers. And so technology is certainly advancing how things are being done in the NHL. I think what's happening and where things need to shift in the NHL is having somebody that understands the data, understands the technology and understands how to communicate that information, but can be the conduit for all the different key stakeholders in the organization to utilize that information at a high level. And I think that's where, teams that might have someone in a position of being the kind of that high performance director are going to hopefully have success long term, because you're not necessarily going to be the guy actually doing the measuring or taking the information and collecting it, but you understand it well enough to disseminate what that information means, not only to the players, but to the medical staff, to the front office and to the coaching staff, and provide insights on what we can be doing, not only from an intervention standpoint, but also using your network to outsource experts in that area if it's something that is a problem for your group. So I think that's where the direction is shifting in the NHL. And I think for teams to really sustain success long term, I think you have to have someone in that position that has that experience using some of this information, but someone that maybe has the 30,000 foot view of how it's affecting the overall performance of the organization. Because I can tell you, when I'm the one doing the workouts, I'm the one ordering the post-game za, I'm the one making the shakes, and someone tells me, hey, this isn't working, I'm too invested in doing all those things to take myself out of it and say, I should have done something different. So I think that's where the industry and specifically in the NHL, I think, that direction, if it can continue to go in that direction, I think teams are going to find, high levels of sustained success if the roster is put together correctly. And, I think, the personnel is critical there.
That information or that person that you're referring to who amalgamates all this, do you feel that individual, I'm not suggesting they have to play the sport at a high level. Maybe they don't even play the sport at all, but do you not, or do you believe that person has to understand the technical and tactical elements of the sport? Because that's the context that brings the numbers to life. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, look, dude, I can, I'm working with the Italian Ice Hockey Federation. Yeah, I'm not Italian. I can go there and I can learn some Italian and I can communicate but it's all about communicating effectively what you want to have happen, right? And
Yep.
I don't think you had to have been an NHLer or a player of any sort of proficiency at a high level to contribute to the improvement of an athlete's chances of sustaining high levels of performance and staying healthy while doing that. I think it's a matter of understanding the things that you're measuring, right? Certainly understanding the physics, the metabolic demand, all those different things. The language of the sport, for sure. You're not going to go out and call it a pitch. It's a sheet of ice. So understanding the language, and then I think most importantly, just being able to communicate with different people that have different ways of looking at things and saying, okay, these are the things that we're seeing. I think this is the best, transition into making this change for this guy. So I don't necessarily think you have to, be a former hockey player, just like you don't have to be Italian to speak Italian or work in Italy. I think it's just critical to be able to communicate effectively and have a really solid foundation of understanding on the characteristics that you're trying to communicate on.
Well stated, which brings me to my last question, but it's a perfect tie-in here. Current appointment, Italian Ice Hockey Federation. Take us behind the curtains. What does your job entail? What are your current projects, if you're able to share those with us?
Yeah. I mean, as all things generally happen, the jobs pop up and someone that you're buddies with calls you and says, hey, I want to bring you on here. So this happened with the national team. One of my closest friends working in hockey, Greg Ireland, is the head coach of the Italian Ice Hockey Federation's national team. He's also been coaching in Europe for several years and recently resumed the head role with Bolzano and is, in Italy currently. He called me a couple of years ago and said, hey, I've got this job. Are you interested? And, with COVID, I ended up not being able to go. Last year, I was supposed to go over the first time to World Championships. I actually got COVID after getting vaccinated and then missed World Championships.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it was, so it's been a couple of years in the making here, and I finally got to go over this year for the first international break, worked with the team at a camp, and then we actually had the Euro Challenge in Budapest. So, for me, it's been a great opportunity because I think part of the role for high performance practitioners, and especially in hockey now, is really going to be, shifted towards development. I think that's going to be another one of those characteristics that if you can develop your athletes more effectively, you're probably going to have those guys in your system, performing at the NHL level at some point. With the Italian national team, the opportunity was exciting because the team didn't qualify for the Olympics this year, but they do host the Olympics in 2026. And the goal of the Ice Hockey Federation and the Ice Sports Federation is to not only put a team on the ice that doesn't get crunched by every team that they play, but can compete and represent, the country well. And that is going to come from developing young Italian ice hockey players, because the International Ice Hockey Federation doesn't allow a Canadian Italian or American Italian to play for the Italian national team unless they've played for 16 months in Italy.
Oh, wow.
And if you're not born there. And so what happens is, the Ice League and the Alps League aren't going to pay most of those players enough money to leave their NHL or their American League teams. So you have to find players that are domestic or that have played in that Alps League or that Ice League. So you're developing culture, you're developing strategies for them to understand that these are the things I need to be doing to become a top level professional, and more so taking your experiences or taking my experiences working with NHLers over the last 10 years and really providing these young players with understanding of what you're going to, these are going to be the guys you're competing against. Here are some of the things that they're really, really good at. Here are some of the things that you can do to kind of, put yourself in a position to be successful, but also finding, opportunities for them to, give them resources that they don't necessarily have at their clubs in Europe. And, it's a really cool opportunity to support a country who's got a big goal over the next 4 years, and to help some of these young players really develop. And, there's a lot of talent there, man. There's a ton of talent, and they're just, they're not getting scouted. And, it's cool to see when you get some of these guys really perk up and you follow their stats online, and, they're doing well. And I'm fortunate to have some technology with Fit where I can program for them, and I can send them, a text, and it pops right up on their phone, and they can do their off ice work in conjunction with what their team's doing, and support them remotely. So, it's been a great opportunity, and I think it's exciting. Hopefully I can go to the Olympics in 2026.
Congratulations. That sounds extremely exciting. One last tie-in regarding your presentation on profiling. Is that available for purchase right now, or is that shut off?
Yeah. I think you can go on and purchase that. I think it's at fit.io. I think you go in and you can purchase that and check it out. Much like I told the people that watched it, if there's any questions on profiling, I'm not that I'm any sort of expert in profiling, but I'm happy to chat profiling anytime, just like I am with, force plates. And I think it's definitely, one of those things that if teams and individuals can start to really understand, it can make your job so much easier when it comes to, picking the right things to work on with individual guys.
Our guest today has been Eric Renaghan. Eric, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sam.